The Alpha King ignored every noble lady. Then an orphan girl changed his fate forever. Caelion Voss had not always been a cold man. There was a time, many years ago, when he believed deeply in something. A feeling, a pull, a quiet force that the old legends called the mate bond. He had been young then, full of patience and hope, certain that one day his wolf would recognize its other half. But year after year passed, and nothing came. No pull, no warmth, no recognition, just silence. He stopped waiting quietly, and started working loudly instead. He ended 3 border wars. He rebuilt flooded villages with money from his own treasury. He rode through storms to reach people who needed their king, and he stayed until the job was done. His people respected him. Some feared him. Most simply watched him from a careful distance, the way one watches a fire that gives heat but gives no comfort. Every few months, his council arranged what they called a presentation night. Noble families from across the kingdom of Velthar would send their daughters to Castle Duskmere, dressed beautifully, hoping that the Alpha King would feel something when he looked at them. He never did. He would walk the line slowly, look at each woman with quiet respect, and feel absolutely nothing. Then he would say one word, enough, and leave the hall. His oldest advisor, a war general named Aldrich, had stopped arguing with him about it. He simply watched from his chair in the corner, his weathered face giving nothing away, and waited for something to change. On an ordinary autumn evening, something did. Caelion had a habit his guards hated. He liked to ride beyond the castle walls alone, in plain clothes, without a title or a crown, or anyone announcing who he was. He called it checking on the kingdom. His guards called it unnecessary risk. He did it anyway. That evening, a storm arrived without warning. The sky turned dark quickly, and rain began to fall in cold, heavy sheets. Caelion was near the village of Ashfen when he heard something, not a scream, but a very determined voice, saying very frustrated things to a wheel that was no longer attached to a cart. He found her at the edge of a collapsed bridge, a young woman, soaked through, her dark hair pressed flat against her face, trying to drag a wounded elderly man to shelter, while also somehow holding together what remained of her broken cart. She was not asking for help. She was not crying. She was simply working, furiously and without pause, as though the storm were a personal inconvenience she intended to outlast. Caelion got off his horse and helped her without asking, and without introducing himself. Together they carried the old man, her neighbor, she explained, not even a relative, to a small shelter near the road. She checked his injuries with practiced hands, made a careful assessment, and declared him bruised but not broken. Then she looked around the shelter, looked at the rain outside, and sighed the sigh of someone adding up a list of tomorrow's problems. She barely thanked him. She was too occupied. He noticed 3 things before he left. First, she smelled like rain and cedar, and something underneath that he could not name, but also could not stop thinking about. Second, she looked at him the way almost nobody did, not with awe, not with calculation, not with anything except mild acknowledgement that he existed and had been useful. Third, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, something inside him had shifted. He did not know what to call it. He rode home through the rain and sat with it in silence. Her name was Mira. He learned that later, when he came back. She had grown up in Ashfen, orphaned at 9 when the gray fever took her parents. No family name, no rank, no inheritance. She was what the old bloodlines called an omega, the lowest category in the shifter world's long and self-important hierarchy. She had been raised by the village collectively, by neighbors and old women, and anyone willing to share a meal or a skill. An elderly herbalist named Sarah had taught her the names and uses of plants. Mira had been an excellent student. She had heard of Alpha King Caelion Voss the same way she had heard of drought seasons and winter floods, as something real and distant and entirely outside her daily concerns. She did not know the man in the rain was him. Caelion told himself he was going back to check on the old man. He found Mira in the market instead, in the middle of a disagreement with a merchant over the price of medicinal bark. The merchant was louder. Mira was more patient and more precise, and she won. Caelion watched from across the square. He was standing very still. When he approached her, she recognized him from the bridge, and nodded briefly, already moving toward her next task. He fell into step beside her. He asked questions, real ones, not polite ones, and she answered directly and asked questions back. Nobody asked him questions. He had forgotten how much he liked it. He came back the following week, and the week after that, he still had not told her his name. The bond arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, which felt entirely wrong for something that important. Mira was showing him how to identify medicinal herbs in the forest outside Ashfen. She had decided, at some point in the previous weeks, that he was interested in learning, and she was teaching him without making a ceremony of it. She reached past him to point at a low plant growing near the roots of an old tree, her hand brushing against his arm for just a moment. Caelion went completely still. It was not like lightning, the way the stories described it. It was more like something that had always been there finally opening its eyes, a recognition, a warmth that moved through him slowly and settled somewhere deep, as though it intended to stay. Mira straightened up and continued talking. She noticed, perhaps, that she had been walking and talking with this quiet stranger for 2 hours, and had not once looked for a reason to leave. She noticed, perhaps, that the afternoon felt unusually easy. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold, and kept explaining the difference between two plants that looked nearly identical. Caelion walked home in the kind of silence that happens when the world has rearranged itself, and the mind is still catching up. He sat in his throne room alone that night, and stared at the wall for a long time. She was his mate, an Omega, an orphan. A woman who argued with merchants about the price of bark and carried injured neighbors through storms without being asked. A woman with no title, no bloodline, no name the court would recognize. He told himself this would be complicated. He was not wrong. He told her who he was, on a quiet evening by the river, sitting on the bank while the water moved past them in the last of the daylight. He said his full name. He said his title. Then he stopped talking and let her process it. She stared at him. Then she stood up, said she had to go home, and left. 3 days passed. She did not come to the market on her usual days. He sent no guards, no summons, no formal requests. On the 3rd day, he rode to Ashfen in plain clothes and knocked on her door and waited. He stood on her doorstep for a long time. He had nowhere more important to be. She eventually opened the door. They sat across from each other in her small house while the evening settled around them, and she asked what he wanted, not what he was going to do, not what the council expected, but what he actually wanted. He answered honestly, which cost him something. He told her that he wanted her near him, that he had not felt this way about anything in a very long time, that he did not care what it cost. She looked at him for a while after that, measuring something she did not put into words. Then she asked if he wanted tea, and he said yes, and that was the beginning of a different kind of evening. The council was not gentle about it. When Caelion returned to the castle and told them he had found his mate, there was a long and uncomfortable silence. When they learned who she was, 2 members stood up and left the room. A rival Alpha Lord sent a formal letter suggesting that Velthar's royal line was being compromised. 3 noble families withdrew their goodwill quietly, like people pulling their hands back from a table they had decided not to eat at. Caelion listened to all of it. He let people speak. Then he reminded them, quietly and without raising his voice, of the campaigns he had fought, and the decisions he had made, and the years he had spent protecting a kingdom that was now questioning his judgment. He told them they could advise him. He told them they could not choose for him. It was Aldrich who stood up last, old and slow-moving, his face a map of long service. The general looked around the room and said simply that the king had waited longer than any of them. If the bond had chosen this woman, then the bond knew something they did not. He stood with the king. The room went quiet. A formal challenge followed, an old law, rarely used, that allowed the court to question a mate claim if the chosen person was considered unfit for a royal position. Mira was summoned to Castle Duskmere. She arrived in her ordinary clothes. She sat in the great hall while nobles examined her lineage, which did not exist in their records, and her knowledge of court etiquette, which had 2 gaps she freely admitted. Then she was presented with the 3rd challenge, a document that would grant her a noble family name, retroactively constructed, if she agreed to sign it. She read it. She put it down. She said she was who she was. She said that if that was not enough, she would go home. The hall was silent. Then Caelion began to applaud, slowly at first, then joined by Aldrich, then by the castle staff standing at the edges of the room, then, slowly, reluctantly, but genuinely, by the remaining members of the council. Even people who disagreed with the situation found it difficult not to respect what had just happened in front of them. The political arguments were still running when the real crisis arrived. The Blood Pact protecting Velthar, an ancient agreement that had held the kingdom's borders for generations, was weakening faster than anyone had predicted. A rival pack crossed the border. Villages were threatened. Caelion rode out to lead the defense himself. It was harder than expected. 3 enemy alphas had coordinated their attack and were targeting him specifically. He was outnumbered and injured when Mira arrived, not with weapons, but with medicine she had prepared herself, moving through the chaos without hesitation, keeping wounded soldiers alive long enough to matter. She reached Caelion in the worst moment of the fight, and the bond between them, fully acknowledged now and no longer held at arm's length, did something that no one in the court had thought to look for in the oldest texts. A true mate bond between a fated Alpha King and his recognized queen renewed the Blood Pact. It had always been this way. The knowledge had simply been lost, because no king in living memory had found his true mate before. The rival Alphas felt the shift in power move through the ground beneath their feet. They withdrew. The ceremony was small, at Mira's request. She stood in the great hall of Castle Duskmere, in clothes she had helped choose, her hair the way she actually wore it, surrounded by her neighbors from Ashfen and the castle staff who had watched everything unfold. The old man from the bridge was there, fully healed, sitting in the front row with the expression of someone who had a very good story to tell. Caelion placed the crown on her head, and before the formal words came, he leaned close and said quietly, only for her, that he had waited 10 years, and she had been worth every one of them. Mira, who did not cry easily, cried. In the year that followed, the kingdom changed in ways that were quiet, but lasting. The queen was known for traveling to villages herself, for listening to disputes at ground level, for being nearly impossible to manipulate because she had no interest in court politics, and everyone could see it. The noble families learned, slowly and without much enthusiasm, to respect her, not because of her title, but because she was reliable and direct, and treated people the same way whether or not they could do anything for her. Caelion laughed more. Not the kind of laugh a king performs for a room, but the kind that happens when someone sitting across from you says something unexpectedly funny at dinner. He laughed often. The Blood Pact held strong. There was an heir on the way. And in Ashfen, the people who had raised a girl with nothing at all told the story the way they always had, not as something magical, not as a fairy tale, but as a simple and documented fact. She had always been going to change something. They just had not known, until it happened, that it would be a king.